Pakistan International Airlines Flight 268 has taken off from Karachi and is now nearing Tribhuvan Airport in Nepal. The plane is flying through thick clouds, with Nepal's dangerous mountains hidden below. Everything looks normal in the cockpit, but then the plane starts descending below its assigned altitude. 9,500 feet, now they're way too low. 9,000 feet, still nothing visible outside. 8,000 feet. All they see are dense clouds, but right behind those clouds, a massive mountain is standing tall, and no one in the cockpit has any idea. At 7,800 feet, the plane had already left the safe flight path. With every passing second, it was getting closer to the mountain. Suddenly, the terrain pull-up alarm blared in the cockpit. The pilot immediately pulled the nose up, but it was already too late. Would the pilot be able to save the plane? Let's find out. This is the heart-stopping story of Pakistan International Airlines Flight 268. The morning of September 28, 1992, started like any other ordinary day in Karachi, Pakistan's biggest city. Jinnah International Airport was bustling as usual. Planes were coming and going, and passengers were getting ready to head to their destinations. Amid all this, a Pakistan International Airlines flight was prepping for its next journey in one part of the airport. This was PIA Flight 268. Scheduled to fly from Karachi to Kathmandu, the capital of Nepal. It wasn't a very long flight. The distance between the two cities was about 1,840 kilometers, and the trip was expected to take around 4 hours, so just a routine flight for PIA. It wasn't anything new. The plane being used today was a 16-year-old Airbus A300. It's a big wide-body jet, specially designed for long and medium-haul flights. Despite its age, this aircraft was still actively flying with many airlines around the world back then. Before the flight, all the preparations at the airport were being wrapped up quickly. The ground crew was busy getting the plane ready for takeoff. The fuel had already been loaded, and the cargo was being loaded onto the plane. Slowly, the passengers started taking their seats. Once everything was set, there were a total of 155 passengers and 12 cabin crew members on board. Besides them, 2 flight engineers were also present in the cockpit, along with the pilots. Altogether, it was a fully packed plane, carrying hundreds of lives eagerly waiting to reach their destinations. Now, let's take a look at the pilots inside the cockpit who were in charge of this flight. Sitting in the right seat was Captain Iftikhar Janjua. He was 49 years old and a very experienced pilot, with over 13,000 hours of flying time. He had plenty of flying experience. Out of those, he had spent nearly 6,000 hours flying this very Airbus A300. He wasn't just a pilot, he was also a flight instructor, meaning he trained new pilots. Because of that, he was highly respected in the cockpit, and people usually didn't question his decisions. Sitting in the right seat was First Officer Hassan Akhtar. Hassan, 38 years old, had about 6,000 hours of flying time and was known as a hard-working and capable pilot. But there was a very interesting and important relationship between the two of them. First, Hassan Akhtar used to be a student of Captain Janjua. The basic flying skills Hassan learned were taught by Janjua himself, and now that same student was flying a plane alongside his mentor. On the surface, their relationship seemed strong and trustworthy, but deep down, it was just as fragile, and that was about to become its biggest weakness. At that time, the cockpit culture at Pakistan International Airlines was such that the captain's decision was almost final. Even if junior pilots felt something was wrong, they hesitated to speak up openly, and this would later. Hesitation almost ruined this whole flight. Before we move on with the video, just a quick thing. Less than 3% of you watching have actually subscribed to this channel. Meanwhile, these videos take months of research, fact-checking, scripting, and editing to make. I always try to not just give you the surface info, but show the full truth of every story in the most cinematic and detailed way possible. So, if you like what I'm doing and want to see more high-quality videos like this, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now, because your small subscription makes us feel that all the hard work we've put in for months is actually reaching people, and they like it. Everything seemed normal for now. Boarding finished in no time and the cabin doors were shut. Then at around 11:13 in the morning, the flight took off from Karachi. The destination of this flight was Tribhuvan International Airport, which is considered one of the most challenging airports in the world. It's surrounded by huge Himalayan mountains all around, and that's why the world's tallest mountain, Mount Everest, is right there in the region. But that's just the beginning. Some of these mountains are over 28,000 feet high, and between them, There's a tiny runway just about 100 feet wide. That means planes have to land in a really tight space. So landing at this airport is far from easy because pilots can't just come straight in. The path is surrounded by mountains and valleys. They have to use a step-down approach, which means they descend slowly in small stages. They descend in altitude as they approach the runway. At every step, they have to maintain the right height and direction. Otherwise, the plane could crash into a mountain. Neither pilot had much recent experience landing at Kathmandu Airport. In other words, this route wasn't familiar to them, and the airport itself had a major drawback. There was no radar or modern navigation system. This basically meant that the air traffic controllers on the ground, who guide the planes, couldn't see on their screens where the plane was at that moment or which direction it was heading. So the pilot had to do everything on their own. They used to look at paper maps and rely on a device called DME. DME stands for Distance Measuring Equipment. This device does just one thing. It tells you how far the plane is from the airport. The plane sends a signal to a transmitter on the ground. The signal bounces back, and based on how long it takes, the distance is calculated. But here's the real problem. DME only tells you the distance. It doesn't tell you if you're heading in the right direction. It doesn't tell you if your altitude is correct. Whether it's right or not, whether the speed is correct or not. The pilot had to figure all this out in his own head. Then he had to radio ATC and tell them. So the whole system depended on the pilot's own calculations, and on top of that, the weather was working against them. Thick fog in Kathmandu, strong winds, and sudden weather changes are pretty common here, especially in winter. In such conditions, finding the right path through the mountains and descending safely becomes even tougher. So just imagine, no radar, no GPS, tall mountains all around, bad weather, and two pilots who didn't have much experience here. And moving forward, these conditions were about to turn deadly for this flight. As the plane got closer to Kathmandu, the weather started to change. Thick, heavy layers of clouds had gathered high up in the sky. The entire ground below was hidden behind those clouds. Visibility was almost zero. The crew had already been warned that the clouds in the area were extremely dense, but the flight wasn't going to be stopped. After about a 3-hour flight, around 2 p.m. the crew contacted Kathmandu Air Traffic Control. Pakistan 268 reporting thwarting 30 kilometers wind, 180 degrees. Expect Sierra approach, Roger. Call you at 30 kilometers. Expecting Sierra approach. The Sierra approach commander at ATC instructed the crew to land in Kathmandu using the Sierra approach. Now, what exactly is this Sierra approach? It's really important to understand. South of Kathmandu Airport lies the Mahabharat mountain range, a long chain of huge, dense, and very tall mountains. The Sierra approach passes right over these mountains, and since there are mountains below, the plane can't just come straight down. You have to use a special method called a step-down. This is called an approach. It means descending step by step, just like when you walk down the stairs of a tall building, one step at a time, slowly. In this approach, at every set distance, there's a specific altitude the pilot has to maintain precisely. There's a reporting point called Romeo 41 miles from the airport, where the plane should be at 15,000 feet. Then, at 16 miles, it needs to be at 11,500 feet. At 13 miles, 10,500 feet. At 10 miles, 9,000 feet. And at 8 miles, 8,200 feet. After that, the plane lines up straight with the runway and makes a safe landing. The stairs aren't just a path. They're the wall between life and death. Going even a foot below these set heights means a direct risk of crashing into the mountains. And in just a little while, Flight 268 was about to get dangerously close to that limit. A short time later, the cockpit reported in. The plane had now started descending slowly, following that step-down approach. The clouds above were so thick that not even a tiny piece of land could be seen below. That meant the pilots had to rely completely on their instruments and the approach chart. They were relying on it, not trusting their own eyes at all. As they were descending, stormy clouds appeared ahead. The pilots asked ATC for permission to change their route a bit to avoid those clouds. Kathmandu, Pakistan 268 will need to change our track by 18 to 28 kilometers for a clear route. Roger, 19 to 28 kilometers right of track, cop that. ATC gave the approval when the plane was about 16 dmi, that is, roughly 16 miles from the airport. At the same time, a very serious and dangerous mistake happened that messed up the whole situation. First Officer Akhtar reported to ATC that they were descending down to 11,500 feet. It felt like everything was going according to plan. But the reality was totally different. At that time, the plane had already descended to 10,500 feet. That means, instead of reaching the altitude at the 13-mile point, they hit it at 16 miles. To put it simply, the whole step-down approach got shifted one step ahead. The pilot mistook the second step for the first. It might sound like a small mix-up, but in this mountainous area, that tiny mistake was about to become deadly in just a few minutes. Hey, what just happened? The plane was now flying about 1,000 feet below its assigned altitude, where it was supposed to be. The real danger was that the pilots in the cockpit had no idea. At 13 miles out, the plane should have been at around 10,500 feet, but it was only at 9,500 feet. Then, at 10 miles, the altitude dropped further to 8,200 feet. But that altitude was actually meant for the 8-mile point. In other words, with every step, the plane was flying lower than it should, and with every passing second, the safe distance between it and the mountains below was getting smaller and smaller. The cockpit. The pilots had no idea the plane was slowly heading into a dangerous situation, and the air traffic control didn't fully grasp how serious things were either. Meanwhile, everything in the cockpit seemed completely normal. According to the cockpit voice recorder, both pilots were calmly chatting. They were getting ready to lower the landing gear and going through the checklist. They were totally confident that everything was fine and that the plane would land safely in just a few minutes. In psychology, this is called confirmation bias. When your mind convinces you that everything is okay, people tend to notice only the signs that confirm their beliefs, and potential dangers often go unnoticed. At that time, the plane was flying through thick clouds. Outside the windows, there was nothing but a white fog, and the mountains below were completely hidden. The pilot was relying entirely on his instruments and the approach chart. But then, just seconds after reporting they were 10 miles out to ATC, a loud warning suddenly blared in the cockpit. Terrain, terrain, pull up, pull up. It was the ground proximity warning system alert. The alarm went off when the plane got dangerously close to the ground or a mountain. Now the system was warning the pilots that something was very close below. The cockpit, which had been calm just moments ago, suddenly filled with tension. Captain Iftikhar Yanjua was startled because, according to him, the plane should have been at a safe altitude with at least about 1,000 feet of clear space below. But the GPWS doesn't give false warnings. Within seconds, the pilots realized the situation could be serious. The captain made a quick decision. The throttle was pushed forward with full force. The engine power was increased, and they started trying for maximum climb to get the plane up. But a jet doesn't just shoot up instantly. At such high speed, flying so low over hilly terrain, it takes a few crucial seconds to gain altitude. Unfortunately, those were the seconds they didn't have left. The plane was still inside thick clouds, and the pilot couldn't see a thing ahead. They could only hear the alarms blaring and keep trying to lift the plane up. They were trying. But just seconds later, through the white layer of clouds, a sudden black rocky slope appeared right ahead. There was no way to escape now. At exactly 2:30 in the afternoon, Pakistan International Airlines Flight 68 crashed into the mountain. This spot was about 15 kilometers from Tribhuvan Airport. The impact was so sudden and forceful that the front part of the plane hit the mountain slope head-on. Within moments, the entire Airbus A300 shattered into pieces. Flames started rising, and the debris scattered far and wide across the mountain slope. At that moment, inside the plane, all 167 passengers died. It all happened so suddenly, and in such a short time that no one had a chance to react or escape. The debris scattered down the mountainside told the story of that terrible crash. But back then, the people in Kathmandu's control tower had no idea what had just happened a few minutes ago. As the minutes passed, everyone in the tower grew more and more worried, because situations like this usually mean there's a serious problem. Finally, the officials immediately launched a search and rescue operation. A decision was made. Nepali Army helicopters were sent to the area where the plane was last in contact. Due to the hilly terrain and bad weather, this mission wasn't easy. A few hours later, when the search helicopters reached the area, the scene below was horrifying. Burnt seats, passengers' belongings, and children's toys were scattered all over the mountain. Recovering bodies from the wreckage and identifying them was an extremely painful task. Many people were identified by their clothes or personal items, while the identity was never confirmed. Now, the biggest question was, how did this accident even happen? To find the answer, a detailed investigation was launched. The Nepal government set up an inquiry committee and recovered the plane's flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder from the crash site. Both black boxes were sent to Paris for thorough analysis to understand the plane's condition right before the accident. When the initial data was studied, something shocking came to light. The plane was everything was under control. The engines were working fine and the plane was set up for landing. This clearly meant the accident wasn't caused by a technical fault. So, the problem was somewhere else. But when the black box data was compared with this chart, a serious mistake came to light. The plane was flying about 1,000 feet lower than it should have at every stage. This error turned out to be fatal a few minutes later. When the plane reached the reporting point called Sierra, it was supposed to be at around 8,200 feet. But in reality, they were flying at about 7,200 feet. Right ahead, at the same height, there was a tall hill. The pilots didn't even realize how close they had gotten, and just seconds later, the plane crashed straight into that hill. The investigation suggested that the approach chart the pilots were using to determine their altitude wasn't properly secured in the cockpit. Back then, approach charts were really small, just about a 4-inch piece of paper. It's possible that while holding the chart, the top part slipped out of their fingers, playing. If the 11,500-foot line was hidden, then only the 10,500-foot mark below would be clearly visible. This might be why the plane kept flying about 1,000 feet lower at every stage. And in the end, this small-looking mistake turned into a major tragedy. If you found this story shocking, then watch this video